The air was thick, humid, and sour with exhaust as the city awoke in a haze of noise and indifference. But she was already on the move, wheels trembling beneath her, hands aching, belly heavy with life that kicked and twisted inside her, as if it, too, sensed something was wrong. The clinic stood at the end of a cracked sidewalk like a promise she no longer believed in. Sterile white walls shadowed by the rotting billboard above it that read, "Care, compassion, community." A lie wrapped in clean paint. Her fingers gripped the rubber wheels harder as she crossed the last patch of pavement. Every roll forward met with a jolt of pain from her lower back. Every stare from passers-by like another blow she couldn't deflect. They didn't see her. Not really. Just a chair. Just another black woman in distress. She reached the doors and buzzed the intercom, the cold metallic voice on the other side asking for ID she didn't have and insurance she never could afford. "Please," she said, her voice cracking. "I'm in pain. I think I'm going into labor." Silence. Then a buzz, not of approval, but dismissal. No intake without documentation. Try County General. County General was 17 blocks away and her phone battery was dead. "Please, I need help." The line clicked off. She sat there, outside the clinic that promised compassion, her heart pounding like it was trying to escape her chest, eyes burning as she realized the doors would not open. Inside, a nurse laughed at something on her phone. A doctor passed by the security camera and didn't even glance at the screen. Someone inside was sipping coffee. Life inside moved on. Outside, it stalled. Time crawled. Sweat ran down her face as the sun rose higher, unforgiving. Still, no one came. Hours passed. People passed. A man tossed her a half-eaten sandwich without looking. She didn't eat. Her belly tightened again. Another contraction. She cried quietly, like someone who had already done it too many times for the sound to mean anything. She wasn't asking anymore. She was surviving. And in that silence, in that stillness beneath the camera's blind eye, something cracked. Not just inside her, but in the very fabric of what this place pretended to be. Something had been broken, and though no sirens wailed and no alarms rang, the world had just shifted. The clinic didn't know it yet, but it would. The next morning, the city stretched itself awake again, the way predators yawn after a meal, unaware of, or uninterested in, the bones left beneath their feet. The clinic opened its doors at exactly 7 a.m., same as always, with the same scripted smiles and the same laminated mission statements hanging in the lobby like empty prayers. Inside, the receptionist adjusted her badge and took her place behind the desk, scrolling absently through headlines on her phone before patients began to file in. No one mentioned the woman from the day before. No one even looked outside where the tire marks of her wheelchair had left smudges in the dust like fading scars. Security footage had been reviewed, deleted, re-recorded over by 4 a.m. She had been erased like a glitch in a system that couldn't afford to care. But the staff remembered. They wouldn't say it, but they did. A whisper between nurses. She didn't belong here anyway. A shrug from a young intern. She should have gone to the city hospital. The unspoken words hung heavy. One of them. No insurance, no appointment, no use. They all had seen her. Every one of them. But that's what silence is good for. It's a convenient grave. Meanwhile, a patient walked in, blonde, well-dressed, barely pregnant, and immediately escorted to a private room. When a young black girl with dreadlocks and an anxious voice asked for help for her mother, she was told to wait. "We're backed up," said the receptionist without looking up. She wasn't. They weren't. The waiting room was only half full, but the rules weren't about numbers. They were about categories. The type of person you were, the type of story you came with. And the woman in the wheelchair hadn't been the right kind of story. One nurse, new, young, with a conscience still intact, whispered to a colleague, "Did you see her yesterday? The woman outside?" The answer was flat, cold. "She made a scene. People like that always do. It's not our fault she didn't follow protocol." The young nurse looked away, swallowing something bitter. The hallway lights hummed. Behind the front desk, the security monitor flickered once, just for a second, and for a moment it showed her, A frozen image, her face exhausted, frightened, defiant. Then it disappeared, erased again. The system had no room for ghosts, no time for truth. A delivery man walked through the front doors with a box of fresh syringes and gave a long, slow glance to the receptionist. "You see the one from yesterday?" he asked casually. "The chair girl." The receptionist laughed too loudly. "She's probably sleeping under a bridge by now. Either that or she figured out how to scam county." They both chuckled. The laugh lingered, sharp and wrong. The kind of laugh you don't forget. And outside, far from their voices, far from their smiles and their bleach-scrubbed hands, the woman sat beneath a broken bus stop sign, alone, her contractions coming harder, slower now, her face pale, her body cold. She had stopped crying. Even pain had limits. And as the sky turned grey with an unexpected drizzle, no one at the clinic knew, or cared, that tomorrow, everything would change. By the time the sun rose again, the rain had dried, but the city still stank of wet asphalt, and something fouler, something invisible, but thick enough to choke on. In a corner of a cracked sidewalk beneath the broken bus stop sign, the woman sat slumped in her wheelchair, skin damp, hair clinging to her face, arms wrapped around her swollen belly like she could shield the life inside from the filth outside. A sanitation truck passed her without slowing down. Inside the cab, the driver glanced once and then looked away. He didn't want to know. No one did. A few blocks away, the clinic was already buzzing. The staff wore their neat uniforms, their name tags polished, their eyes rehearsed into polite deadness. The receptionist clicked through her emails while sipping a caramel latte, her inbox filled with reminders about diversity seminars and inclusive policy guidelines. It would have been laughable if it weren't so cruel. A poster on the wall read, "We see you, we hear you." The lie stared back at every patient, printed in 4 languages. But when an older black man in worn-out work clothes stepped in asking if he could get insulin for his wife, the smile vanished from the receptionist's face before he'd finished his sentence. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, voice flat. He didn't. He never could. She pointed him toward a clipboard without looking up again, her fingers already moving to summon security if he lingered too long. Minutes later, a white woman entered in athletic gear. No mask, no ID, but with a breezy tone and a confident smirk. "I left my card in the car," she said with a chuckle. "No problem," the receptionist replied, ushering her in with a nod. "We'll get you taken care of." Inside the clinic, whispers circulated like lazy smoke. A few staffers had heard rumors. Someone had found out that the woman outside yesterday had been there for hours. Hours. And no one had gone to help. The rumors came with assumptions, coated in smugness. Probably a drug addict. Probably just dramatic. They always act like they're entitled to everything. No one said black out loud. They didn't have to. It was stitched into their tone, carved into the way they dismissed her pain, how they laughed when her name wasn't in the system. One nurse, older, sharp-eyed, leaned toward a colleague and muttered, "If we bent the rules for every sob story, this place would turn into a circus." She'd been here for 20 years. She'd seen enough. She called it realism. Others just called it what it was. Cold-blooded cruelty. And outside, the woman, Asha, gripped her belly through another contraction that tore a cry from her chest, so loud a dog barked across the street. No humans moved. Her phone had died 2 nights ago. Her emergency contact was her grandmother, dead 5 years. She had no one left. But the child inside her kicked, again and again, as if reminding her there was still something worth holding on for. Somewhere, someone was supposed to care. But that place was not here. Inside the clinic, an administrator reviewed a report about patient flow. He paused for a moment, scanning a brief mention. Unidentified woman, seen outside premises. No interaction recorded. He raised an eyebrow, then shrugged. "Not our responsibility." He signed off the report. At lunch, the staff laughed about a viral meme. They bit into their sandwiches. They talked about weekend plans. And outside, Asha began to feel dizzy, her vision narrowing to a tunnel. Her body trembled. She was fading. And no one inside that pristine building of paper promises and plastic smiles would ever admit that they had let a human being collapse on their doorstep. Because to admit that would mean admitting she mattered, and they had already decided she didn't. Let's take a brief pause. If you're still with us, let us know in the comments where you're listening from. Have you ever experienced something like this, or seen someone go through it? Your voice matters here. Don't forget to follow so you don't miss what happens next. Now, we continue. It was nearing dusk when someone finally noticed her, not out of concern, but irritation. A tall white man in a suit, stepping out of his luxury sedan, glanced over at the slumped figure near the bus stop and frowned. He didn't approach. He walked briskly into the clinic and informed the front desk. "There's a woman outside. Looks like a problem." The receptionist nodded slowly, tapping a key with a long acrylic nail, then called security. "Can someone check out the situation out front? We've got a loiterer." Moments later, a uniformed guard stepped outside, adjusting his belt, his expression already set in stone. He stood over Asha, eyes sweeping her like she was trash left behind. "Ma'am," he said, voice tight, "you can't stay here. This is private property." She didn't respond. She couldn't. Her lips were cracked, her eyes glassy, her breath shallow. "Ma'am," he repeated, louder now, tapping her arm with 2 fingers like she was contagious. When she didn't answer, he radioed in, not for help, but for clearance to remove her. Unresponsive individual, probably under the influence, moving her off-site. A moment later, he grabbed the handles of her wheelchair and rolled her down the sidewalk like luggage someone had forgotten. No ambulance, no nurse, no doctor, just the scrape of wheels against pavement and the sound of a human being discarded. A block away, he left her in front of a shuttered laundromat. Then he walked back to the clinic, whistling softly. Inside, laughter rose from the staff lounge. One nurse showed another a meme about freeloaders and emergency room regulars. It was a cartoon, black of course, clutching a fake injury and demanding drugs. They laughed. The image looked far too much like Asha. She wasn't a person to them. She was a stereotype that made their day feel easier to ignore. She was the problem, the drama, the reason things take too long. Her pain didn't register as pain. It was noise, inconvenience, a reflection they didn't want to see. Down the street, Asha sat motionless, her body beginning to shut down from dehydration, exhaustion, and fear. No pedestrians helped. One woman crossed the street to avoid her. A man walking a dog stared, shook his head, and kept moving. Her hand twitched once. Her breath stuttered. The child inside her shifted one last time. Then stillness. In the clinic, a new patient signed in. The receptionist smiled at her. "We'll take good care of you," she said brightly. The hypocrisy didn't burn, because they never saw it. Not once. They had written Asha off before she even spoke, before she pressed the buzzer, before she even arrived. Because in their world, some people didn't belong in waiting rooms. Some people belonged on sidewalks, and tonight, the sidewalk would keep another secret. The streetlights flickered above Asha as she remained motionless, a still figure on the cold concrete, discarded like so much debris in the city's underbelly. No one stopped to help. No one even hesitated. The sound of passing cars, the clatter of heels on sidewalks, the soft hum of city life, all of it drifted over her, oblivious to the woman in the wheelchair. As darkness swallowed the street, she became nothing but a shadow, a forgotten corner of the city, a place no one wanted to look at too long. But the truth was there, hanging heavy in the night air like a storm waiting to break. Her pain had become invisible. The hours dragged on, slow and cruel, with Asha struggling to hold on to consciousness. The sharp pain from her contractions cut through the fog of dizziness, but her body was too weak to respond. She felt a pressure in her chest, the familiar weight of a world that had never been kind, never given her the opportunity to be more than a stereotype, a problem to be solved with a glance and a few harsh words. Asha had fought so many battles in her life, but this one, this battle for her life and the life of her child, was different. This wasn't a fight she could win alone. As the city slept, the clinic's windows glowed like sentinels in the dark, offering a false sense of safety to those who entered. Inside, the staff went about their evening routine, as if nothing had happened, as if a woman had not been left to die just a few blocks away, discarded as though her existence didn't matter. They filled out reports, they reviewed their charts, and they answered calls from patients who had never known what it was like to be treated like a number. The unspoken truths swirled between the walls of that sterile building. Truths about who was worthy of care and who wasn't. Truths about the systems that had long ago decided Asha's fate the moment she had stepped through the door. Meanwhile, Asha's mind began to slip away from her as the night stretched on. She was no longer certain of how long she had been sitting there, her body shaking with the strain of holding on to life. Her mind drifted to memories, flashes of her childhood, of the promise of a better future, of all the things she had fought for. She remembered the promise she made to her child before they even existed. She would never let them feel the weight of the world's cruelty the way she had. But how could she keep that promise if the world didn't see her, didn't even hear her screams? She thought of her grandmother, who had raised her in a world of love and struggle, teaching her to walk tall despite the weight of oppression on her shoulders. Asha had tried so hard to honor that memory, to push through every barrier, every closed door, every cruel glance. But here she was, abandoned, unprotected, invisible. She could feel the weight of the world bearing down on her, the racist attitudes that had followed her through life, the sneers, the dismissals, the assumptions that no matter how hard she worked, no matter how much she achieved, she would never be seen as more than what they decided she was, a statistic, a burden, a problem to be ignored. The world she lived in was built on invisible walls, walls that divided the worthy from the unworthy, the deserving from the undeserving. And Asha had never been on the right side of those walls. Her race, her class, her gender, they were the labels that determined whether she lived or died, whether her voice would be heard or silenced. Asha was well aware of the bias that permeated every corner of society, but it was the medical system that had broken her spirit most painfully. She had always been told that the healthcare system was there to help, to heal, to offer compassion. But what happens when the system fails you? What happens when the very people who are supposed to help you, who have sworn an oath to care for you, turn their backs on you because you don't fit their narrow definition of worthy? She had known that life would be hard. She had known that her journey as a black woman in a world full of prejudice would be fraught with obstacles. But she had never imagined that the very institution that was supposed to be a lifeline, a place where anyone, regardless of race or class, could find refuge, would be the one to crush her underfoot. The clinic had made its choice, and Asha knew it. The moment she had rolled through those doors, she had been judged before she even spoke. Her skin color, her lack of insurance, her pregnancy, none of these things were seen as reasons to help her. They were reasons to dismiss her, to put her at the back of the line, to leave her in the cold, while others, more deserving, were ushered in with smiles and assurances. The hours stretched on. Her body was failing her. The contractions were coming faster now, but Asha had no strength left to push through them. Her thoughts became fractured, pieces of her reality slipping away like sand through her fingers. She could no longer remember how long it had been since anyone had spoken to her, how long since she had been treated like a person. Then, in the stillness of the night, a figure approached. It was a woman, young, with dark hair tied back in a loose bun, wearing a jacket with a hospital logo. She moved cautiously toward Asha, her eyes scanning the street, ensuring no one was watching. She knelt beside Asha's wheelchair and touched her shoulder gently, as though afraid the woman might break if she moved too quickly. Asha's eyes fluttered open and she blinked several times, trying to focus on the woman in front of her. The woman's face was unfamiliar, but there was something in her gaze that made Asha feel, for the first time in hours, like she was not completely alone. Are you okay?" the woman asked softly. Her voice was laced with concern, but it wasn't the kind of concern that came from duty. It was something more genuine, more human. Asha tried to speak, but her voice came out as a rasp, barely audible. The woman leaned in closer, her face softening with empathy as she held Asha's hand. her fingers warm against the coldness of Asha's skin. "I'm so sorry," the woman said, her voice breaking. "I didn't know. I was supposed to help, but I didn't know. Please don't die out here." Asha's lips parted in a weak attempt to speak, but her words were drowned in a cough that rattled her chest. The woman's eyes filled with tears, her hands trembling as she pulled out her phone. She didn't care about the rules. She didn't care about the system. She just needed to help, to do something. With shaky hands, she dialed 911. The woman spoke quickly, her words tumbling over each other in a frantic attempt to make up for the time that had been lost. She gave Asha's location, described her condition, pleaded for them to hurry. As she spoke, she turned back to Asha, whispering assurances that she would not be left here alone, that help was on the way. But Asha, too weak to hold on any longer, simply closed her eyes and let the darkness swallow her whole. The woman kept talking, her voice steady now, but inside, a storm was brewing. She knew the system had failed Asha. She knew that no one had cared until it was almost too late. And that knowledge, that painful truth, would stay with her long after the ambulance arrived. Asha's story would not be forgotten, not by the woman who had found her, not by anyone who had witnessed the cruelty of a world that could ignore a life so easily. But the woman, too, would have to confront the reality of what it meant to live in a society that could turn away from someone in need, and to face the consequences of a system that was designed to keep some people invisible. The ambulance arrived too late. By the time it screeched to a halt on the corner, its sirens wailing their pathetic hollow cry, Asha had already slipped beyond the edge of the world. The woman who had found her sat beside the lifeless form, her hands still resting gently on Asha's, her breath shallow, heart racing. She hadn't expected to find this. She hadn't expected to watch someone who had been left for dead, someone who had been ignored by everyone else, breathe her last breath just a few moments before help could arrive. The paramedics rushed over, kneeling beside Asha, their faces drawn in the same grim realization. One of them checked for a pulse, then met the eyes of the other paramedic and shook his head. There was nothing to be done. Time of death, 11:47 p.m., the paramedic said, his voice hollow, heavy with the weight of responsibility, but also detached. He had seen too much death in his career to let it faze him, to let it affect him. But the woman's face, the desperation, the struggle, the hopelessness, lingered. This wasn't a heart attack, a car crash, or an accident. This was something different. This was a failure. Asha's death was a product of a society that had pushed her to the edge and then left her there to die. A society that had been complicit in her suffering. Every single person who had turned their back on her. Every person who had made the choice to walk past her without a second glance. The woman who had found her stood up, her knees weak, her body trembling. She had witnessed something she could never unsee. She had been a silent witness to an injustice so deep it reached into the bones of the city. Asha's body lay there, covered with a thin sheet, but the truth of what had happened was exposed for all to see. It was a tragedy that was all too familiar, but it was also one that no one ever really acknowledged. Asha had been denied her humanity, denied her right to be seen, to be cared for, to be treated with dignity. She had been ignored in life and discarded in death. The woman, still in shock, stood there as the ambulance sped away with Asha's body. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know how to process the overwhelming feeling of guilt and helplessness that was beginning to consume her. Her thoughts raced as she replayed the events in her mind, over and over again. Had she known Asha's situation earlier? Could she have done something sooner? Had she acted fast enough? Had it been enough? She cursed herself for not having noticed her earlier, for not having fought harder to get her the care she needed. But as the streetlights flickered above her, as the night air bit at her skin, she realized that there was no point in playing the what-if game. What mattered now was what happened next. The woman pulled out her phone and began typing a message to her colleagues. She couldn't sit idly by and let this pass without a fight. She had to do something. She would do something. This wasn't just about Asha anymore. This was about the system that allowed people like her to slip through the cracks. This was about the clinic, about the staff who had ignored her, about the people who had stood by and watched as another life was wasted because they didn't care enough to act. It was a broken system, one that had long ago chosen who was worth saving and who wasn't. It had written Asha off before she even entered the clinic, before she even rolled through those doors, asking for help. The system had decided that Asha wasn't worthy of care, that she didn't matter, that she was just another black woman, just another statistic, just another body to be discarded when it no longer fit the narrative of deserving people. Her message was short but forceful. We cannot let this go unnoticed. We cannot ignore what happened to her. We have to expose the truth. She hit send and stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, unsure of what would come next. But she knew one thing for certain. Asha's death would not be in vain. She would make sure of that. Meanwhile, inside the clinic, the world continued as it always did. The staff went through their motions, checking in patients, filing reports, answering calls. No one spoke of Asha. No one questioned the system. No one wondered what could have been done differently. The day's work went on, as if nothing had happened. They continued to hold on to their comfortable, sanitized view of the world, where the right people got the care they needed, and the wrong people were simply left behind. It was a world where those with privilege never had to face the consequences of their actions, where racism was subtle but pervasive, a system that told people like Asha that they didn't matter. The nurse who had been involved in Asha's case, who had been one of the many who had passed her by without a second thought, sat at her desk, her mind still preoccupied with the uneventful day she had just endured. She had barely noticed Asha's absence. After all, she had seen so many people like her come and go. It wasn't her responsibility, she thought. It wasn't her fault. She had done what she could, right? She had followed protocol. She had done her job. But deep down, the nurse couldn't shake the image of Asha's face, the look of desperation and fear, the way she had begged for help only to be turned away. She couldn't stop the gnawing guilt that started to creep into her chest. Asha's face, those eyes full of pain, haunted her. What had she missed? What had she failed to see? Was there more to this story than she had been willing to admit? The nurse stood up, pacing in her small office, trying to push the thoughts out of her head, trying to shake the uncomfortable feeling that had taken root. But she couldn't escape it. It was inescapable. She had been part of the system. She had been a cog in a machine that had failed. The guilt weighed heavily on her. But it wasn't just guilt. It was shame. Shame that she hadn't acted sooner. Shame that she had allowed the world to be so indifferent to Asha's suffering. Outside, the woman who had found Asha stood in front of the clinic, her eyes narrowed, fists clenched. She knew the battle she was about to face wouldn't be easy. She was one voice against a system that had spent years perfecting the art of turning a blind eye. But she was done being quiet. Done letting people like Asha die unnoticed, unloved, and uncared for. The world needed to hear the truth. They needed to know what had happened. Her phone buzzed again. A message from a colleague who had heard about the incident. We need to organize. We need to go public. She stared at the message, her resolve hardening. She would be the one to expose this. She would make sure Asha wasn't just another forgotten soul, another number in a list of ignored tragedies. She would fight for Asha, for every person who had ever been made invisible by a system that didn't care. The fight had just begun, and the reckoning was coming. The days following Asha's death moved with a strange sense of inertia. People continued their routines, numb to the tremors beneath the surface, the echoes of something deeper that had cracked open and couldn't be undone. In the heart of the city, beneath its polished veneer, nothing had really changed. The clinic went on as it always had. The same faces behind the desks, the same cold smiles, the same disregard for the people who were supposed to be served. But something had shifted in the air, a quiet storm stirring just beneath the surface, unseen but gathering momentum. The woman who had found Asha, still raw from the experience, spent the next few days in a haze of uncertainty, her emotions torn between rage and sorrow. She couldn't shake the image of Asha's lifeless body, abandoned on the sidewalk. No one had cared. Not until it was too late. Asha's story was just one of many. One of countless lives trampled under the weight of a system built to ignore them. And yet, Asha's death, her unnecessary, preventable death, had sparked something in the woman. She couldn't sit by any longer, not when she knew that the same system that had killed Asha was still operating in plain sight, destroying lives one by one. But even as she steeled herself for the battle ahead, she knew the path would be far from easy. The people in charge, the ones who had turned their backs on Asha, were powerful. They had money, they had influence, and they had a carefully constructed narrative that justified their actions. They would fight to maintain that narrative, to preserve the status quo, and they would use every tool at their disposal: denial, silence, gaslighting, to keep the truth buried. It was early morning when she decided to act. She sat down at her computer, the screen casting a pale blue light on her tired face. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment, unsure of where to begin, unsure of how to make the world see the truth she had witnessed, the truth that everyone else was so eager to ignore. But then she took a deep breath and began typing. She drafted an open letter, addressed to the city's media outlets, to advocacy groups, to anyone who might listen. She wrote with passion, with urgency, recounting the details of Asha's death, how she had been left to die outside the very clinic that was supposed to save her, how the staff had turned away a woman in desperate need of help, not because of anything she had done, but because of who she was. A black woman, pregnant, poor, without the right insurance. She wrote about the cold indifference that had greeted Asha from the moment she arrived, how no one had cared enough to see her as a human being, to hear her cries for help. And then she described the brutal reality that followed, how Asha had been left alone, abandoned to the streets, to die with no one by her side, no one to witness the injustice that had taken place. The woman wrote the letter with every ounce of strength she had, knowing that this would be her only chance to make a difference. She knew that once the truth was out there would be no going back. But that was exactly why she had to do it, because if no one else was going to speak up, then it had to be her. She couldn't let Asha's death be swept under the rug, not when it symbolized everything that was wrong with a system that was supposed to protect people, but instead crushed them under its weight. When the letter was finished, she hit send, and then she waited. The silence that followed was deafening. The world, it seemed, wasn't ready to hear the truth. The media didn't jump on the story. The advocacy groups didn't rush to her side. It was as though the system had shut its doors, locked its windows, and turned a blind eye once again. It was easier to pretend that Asha was just another casualty in a world that was too busy to care. It was easier to ignore the fact that Asha's death wasn't an isolated incident. It was the result of a culture that dehumanized people like her, a culture that had been built on centuries of systemic racism, neglect, and exploitation. But the woman refused to let it go. She began reaching out to anyone who would listen, contacting journalists, community organizers, and even lawmakers. She shared Asha's story with anyone who would take it seriously, and slowly, like a crack in a dam, the truth began to leak out. It wasn't fast, it wasn't easy, but it was happening. Soon enough, the media took notice. The story of Asha's death was picked up by local news outlets, and then by national ones. People began to ask questions. Why had she been left outside? Why had she been denied care? How many others had suffered the same fate and been ignored, forgotten, swept under the rug? But even as the story gained traction, the clinic fought back. The administrators issued statements, claiming that Asha had never been turned away, that there had been a misunderstanding. They claimed that she had refused help, that she had been combative, uncooperative. They painted a picture of a woman who had been unruly, who had somehow caused her own downfall. It was a story that many people would believe, because it was easier to accept than the ugly truth. It was easier to believe that Asha had somehow deserved what happened to her than to acknowledge the deep, entrenched racism that had allowed her to be treated this way. And so, the woman found herself fighting not only for justice for Asha, but against a machine that was intent on covering up the truth. She found herself up against people who were willing to twist the narrative, to bend the facts, to shift the blame. It wasn't just about a single clinic anymore. It was about a system, an entire infrastructure that had been built on the backs of the vulnerable, that had perpetuated inequality for generations. It was a system that told people like Asha that they didn't matter, that their pain didn't matter, that their lives didn't matter. The woman's fight took her to city council meetings, to protests, to interviews. She spoke with an intensity that could not be ignored. But with every step forward, there were setbacks. The clinic's staff denied any wrongdoing. They deflected. They minimized. They blamed Asha for her own death. They claimed that they had followed protocol, that they had done everything by the book. They denied the racism that had permeated their treatment of her. They denied that Asha had been left to die on the street, as though it had never happened. And yet, despite their best efforts to bury the truth, the cracks in the system began to widen. People started to ask questions. People started to listen. It wasn't enough. Not yet. But it was a start. The woman knew that Asha's death would not be the last. It was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of something much larger, something that could not be ignored any longer. The fight for justice for Asha, for every person who had ever been treated like less than human, was just beginning. The reckoning was coming, and there was no turning back. It was time for the world to face the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, no matter how painful. Asha's death was not just a tragedy, it was a warning, a call to action. And the woman who had found her, the woman who had refused to let her be forgotten, would not rest until justice was done. The city had a way of hiding its sins, of glossing over the ugly truths that lay beneath its polished surface. But the noise was growing now, an undercurrent of discontent that could no longer be ignored. The protests had started small. At first, just a handful of people gathering in front of the clinic with signs that read, "Justice for Asha," and "Healthcare is a right, not a privilege." But as the days wore on, the crowd grew larger, more diverse, more impassioned. It wasn't just about Asha anymore. It wasn't just about one woman's death. It was about a system that had failed her, a system that had failed countless others. It was about the deep-rooted racism that had allowed her death to be swept aside, the cruelty that had become normalized in the very institutions that were supposed to protect the most vulnerable. The media coverage was relentless now. Stories of Asha's death were running on every local news station, every social media platform. People began to talk about her, to ask questions that they had never asked before. How many others had been treated like Asha? How many had been denied the care they needed, not because they were unworthy of it, but because they didn't fit the narrow, racially charged definition of who deserved help? It was a question that forced people to confront their own biases, to look at the uncomfortable truths that they had spent so long ignoring. But the clinic fought back. The administrators were desperate. They issued another statement, an attempt at damage control. "We are deeply saddened by the tragic loss of a patient," it read, "but we assure the public that proper procedures were followed." There was no mention of the fact that Asha had been left alone on the sidewalk for hours, that no one had even tried to help her. There was no acknowledgement of the racial bias that had played a part in the way she was treated. It was the same empty rhetoric, the same lies, designed to placate the public, to push the tragedy back into the shadows where it could be forgotten. But the woman who had found Asha wasn't willing to let it go. She had become a beacon for the truth, a symbol of resistance against a system that had tried to bury the facts. She continued to speak out, to demand justice for Asha, for every person who had ever been discarded by the system. She gave interviews. She wrote op-eds. She attended rallies. Every time she spoke, her words cut through the silence like a knife. And every time she spoke, the clinic's narrative started to unravel just a little bit more. But the people in charge didn't give up without a fight. The clinic's administrators began to smear her name, to paint her as a troublemaker, as someone who was simply trying to stir up chaos. They called her unprofessional, unstable, too emotional. They tried to discredit her, to diminish her voice, to make her out to be just another person with an agenda. But it didn't work. Not this time. The truth had already taken root, and no amount of lies could erase it. The woman began to get threats. At first, they were subtle. Anonymous emails, vague messages on social media, whispers in the halls. But as the pressure mounted, the threats grew more intense. One night, she returned to her apartment to find a letter waiting for her, slipped under the door. It was short, crude, and threatening. Keep talking, and you'll end up just like her. The woman didn't flinch. She had known this would happen. She knew that speaking out against the system would come with a price. But she also knew that Asha's death couldn't be allowed to fade into the background, to be forgotten like so many others before her. Asha had been a person. She had had dreams, hopes, a future, until the world had decided she didn't deserve one. And the woman wasn't about to let that happen again. Not on her watch. The protests continued, and they grew more intense. People were tired of being ignored, tired of being dismissed. They were tired of watching as lives were ruined by a system that cared only for profit, for power, for control. The cries for justice grew louder, and the media coverage continued to spread. Asha's name became a rallying cry, a symbol of the injustice that so many had suffered for so long. It was at one of the larger rallies, just outside the clinic, where the tension finally came to a head. The crowd had gathered in force, chanting for justice, chanting for change. The air was thick with anger, with frustration, with the weight of years of neglect and oppression. The police had been called in to disperse the crowd, and as the protesters stood their ground, the situation grew more volatile. The woman who had started it all, who had found Asha and made sure her story was heard, stood at the front of the crowd, her face set in determination. She knew this was bigger than her now. This was about something much larger. This was about the systemic racism that had allowed Asha to die on the sidewalk. This was about the apathy that had allowed people like Asha to be treated like disposable objects, invisible to the very systems that were supposed to protect them. A line of police officers stood at the ready, their faces impassive, their hands resting on their batons. The woman could feel the tension building, the atmosphere charged with a sense of impending violence. The protesters were not backing down. They were tired of waiting, tired of being told that their pain didn't matter. The officers stepped forward, pushing through the crowd with their shields raised. And then, as if on cue, the first blow was struck. A protester was shoved to the ground, and chaos erupted. The woman found herself in the middle of it, swept up in the sea of bodies as the police moved in, trying to disperse the crowd with force. She tried to stay calm, tried to keep her focus, but the sound of yelling, of sirens, of the clash between protesters and police drowned out everything else. She could see people being dragged away, pushed to the ground, their faces bruised and bloodied. The sight of it all, the sheer injustice of it, made her stomach turn. And yet, in the midst of the chaos, she felt something else, something powerful. She realized that this wasn't just about one woman's death anymore. This was about an entire community that had been silenced for too long. About an entire group of people who had been dehumanized, crushed under the weight of a system that didn't care about them. This was about something much larger than her, than Asha. It was about the fight for dignity, for humanity, for equality. The woman was pulled away by a protester, someone who had recognized her, who had seen what she had done. "You need to go," the protester urged. "It's getting too dangerous." She nodded, but she didn't leave. Not in her heart. She stayed right there, in the center of the storm, knowing that she couldn't stop. She couldn't turn away. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. As the protest finally began to disperse, as the crowd was slowly pushed back by the police, the woman stood in the midst of it all, her resolve hardening. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. Asha's death would not be forgotten. It could not be swept under the rug, not while there were still people who cared, people who were willing to fight for justice. The system would have to answer. The truth would be exposed. And as the last of the protesters were escorted away, as the street cleared and the night settled in, the woman stood there alone, knowing that no matter what came next, she would never stop fighting for Asha. She would never stop fighting for the truth. The reckoning had begun, and it would not stop until the world was forced to face what it had done. Asha's name would be remembered. The days following the protest were a blur of media coverage, legal action, and intense public scrutiny. The clinic, once a quiet, overlooked institution, had become the epicenter of a storm that showed no signs of abating. People demanded answers. They wanted accountability. They wanted justice for Asha and for everyone who had ever been discarded by a system that valued profit over people. The woman who had found Asha and sparked the firestorm, still bruised and shaken from the chaos of the protest, knew that the battle was far from over. She could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her words, on her actions, on every decision she made. She had opened a door, and now there was no shutting it. The clinic, the system, the city. They were all under a microscope. Every action, every word, every detail was being scrutinized, analyzed, and dissected. And while the clinic's administrators scrambled to cover their tracks, the woman knew that the truth had already begun to take root. But even as the public clamored for justice, the system fought back. The clinic's board of directors issued a carefully worded statement, a thinly veiled attempt at damage control. "We are deeply concerned by the allegations against our facility," the statement read. "However, we must emphasize that we are committed to providing quality care for all our patients, regardless of race or socioeconomic status. We are reviewing our protocols and will take appropriate action if necessary." The words felt hollow, empty, like a desperate attempt to maintain a veneer of respectability. The clinic's administrators, while publicly expressing remorse, had privately begun to spin a narrative of their own. They accused the protesters of exaggerating the situation, of distorting the truth for political gain. They painted Asha as a difficult, combative patient who had been uncooperative, refusing care, causing a scene. They claimed that there had been no racial bias involved, that Asha had simply fallen through the cracks due to a series of unfortunate circumstances. It was a lie, of course, a lie that was designed to deflect blame and protect the clinic's reputation. And the woman, along with the growing number of activists, knew it. They had seen it happen too many times before. A black woman, struggling to get the care she needed, ignored and dismissed until it was too late. The systems in place, healthcare, law enforcement, politics, they were all built to uphold the status quo. They were built to protect those at the top, to silence those at the bottom. But the woman, now a leader of the movement for Asha and others like her, refused to let that happen. The truth had to be exposed. The world had to see what was happening behind the closed doors of these institutions. She could no longer stand by and pretend that the system could be fixed with empty promises and token gestures. Her next move was strategic. She knew that the media could make or break the story, and she intended to use it to her advantage. The truth was simple. Asha had been left to die because of racism, because of a system that valued the lives of the privileged and discarded the lives of the marginalized. And now, with the public's attention focused on the clinic, it was time to dig deeper. The woman reached out to investigative journalists, to experts in racial disparities in healthcare, to people who had experienced the same kind of neglect and indifference that Asha had. She spent countless hours combing through public records, filing Freedom of Information Act requests, gathering evidence that could expose the full extent of the clinic's failures. The more she dug, the uglier the picture became. It wasn't just Asha. There were others who had been treated the same way, ignored, dismissed, discarded because of their race, their class, their lack of resources. The system had failed them all, and now it was time for the world to see it. The clinic fought back, of course. They tried to silence the journalists, tried to discredit the activists, tried to suppress the growing movement that threatened to unravel everything they had built. They accused the woman of stirring up division, of fueling unrest. They claimed that her actions were dangerous, that the protests were disruptive, that she was undermining the very fabric of the community. But the woman's resolve only grew stronger. She knew the stakes. She knew that if she didn't act, if she didn't continue to push for justice, nothing would ever change. The system would remain the same. People like Asha would continue to die, ignored and forgotten, while those in power would continue to profit from their suffering. One evening, just as the sun was beginning to set, the woman found herself standing outside the clinic once again, this time not as a protester, but as a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. She had been invited to speak at a press conference, her voice now amplified by the media's attention. The weight of the moment hit her as she stood in front of the camera, surrounded by reporters, activists, and city officials. The pressure was suffocating. She knew that everything she said would be scrutinized, analyzed, twisted. She knew that the clinic, the administrators, the people in power would all be listening, waiting for her to slip up, waiting for her to make a mistake. But she didn't falter. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "Today," she began, "we stand here not just for Asha, but for every person who has been denied care because of the color of their skin, the size of their wallet, or the zip code they were born into. We stand here for the forgotten, the neglected, the invisible. We stand here to say, enough." The words hung in the air, and for a moment there was silence. Then, one by one, the reporters began to ask their questions, their voices eager, hungry for more. But it wasn't just the media that was listening. The clinic administrators were watching from the windows, their eyes narrowing as they listened to the woman's every word. The truth was out now. It was no longer just a story. It was a movement, a force that could not be contained. The woman spoke for hours, detailing the systemic racism that had allowed Asha's death to happen, the way that people like Asha were treated as less than human, the way that institutions like the clinic profited from the suffering of the poor and the marginalized. She spoke about the injustice of a system that could ignore the cries of a woman in pain, the cries of a mother who had been abandoned by those who were supposed to help her. And then she said something that struck a chord with everyone present. "We are not here to ask for change," she said, her voice growing stronger. "We are here to demand it. We will not stop until those who are responsible for Asha's death are held accountable. We will not stop until the system is dismantled, piece by piece, until every person is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve." The words hung in the air like a promise, a challenge, a declaration of war against the forces that had allowed Asha to die in the first place. But even as the woman spoke, there were those who were already working behind the scenes to fight back. The clinic's legal team had already begun to prepare their defense. They had hired high-powered lawyers, people who were skilled in turning the narrative in their favor, skilled in manipulating the public's perception. They began to flood the media with counter-narratives, with stories about how Asha had been uncooperative, how the staff had tried their best, how the clinic had followed all protocols. They leaned into the stereotype of the angry black woman, using it to justify their treatment of Asha, to paint her as someone who had brought her fate upon herself. But the woman's words had already ignited a fire that couldn't be extinguished. People began to rally behind her, began to speak out, began to demand justice for Asha. It wasn't just about one woman's death anymore. It was about a system that had been failing people like Asha for generations. And the woman, the symbol of their struggle, was not backing down. As the press conference ended, the woman felt a surge of determination. The fight was far from over, but it was one step closer to the truth being revealed. The clinic might have money, it might have power, but it didn't have the one thing that mattered most: the truth. And the truth, as they all knew now, was unstoppable. The reckoning had arrived, and it would not be silenced. The courtroom was silent, the air heavy with anticipation, the clinking of the metal chairs, the shuffle of papers, the distant murmur of whispers from the press. Everything seemed to fade into the background as the woman stood at the podium, the eyes of the world upon her. Her voice, though steady, carried the weight of everything that had come before this moment. The long nights spent fighting for justice, the sleepless hours spent compiling evidence, the unrelenting pressure of knowing that the story of Asha was just the tip of the iceberg. Today wasn't just about the clinic. It wasn't even just about Asha anymore. It was about something much larger, something that could no longer be ignored. It was about a system that had failed so many. It was about the way that those with power, with privilege, could look away and pretend not to see the pain and suffering of those beneath them. It was about the years of racial injustice, the years of systemic inequality that had allowed lives like Asha's to be discarded so easily. The woman took a deep breath before speaking, her voice rising in the courtroom, clear and unwavering. "We are here today because Asha was failed by the system, by a system that dehumanized her, that saw her as nothing more than an inconvenience. We are here because Asha's death was not just a tragedy. It was the inevitable result of a system that refuses to see people like her, that refuses to acknowledge their worth. She was ignored because she didn't fit the mold of what society deems worthy, because she was a black woman, pregnant, poor, without the right insurance, She was dismissed because of who she was, and that is not just an oversight. It is a failure that cannot and should not be overlooked any longer. Her words echoed in the courtroom, and for the first time, there was silence. Not the uncomfortable silence of avoidance, but a silence filled with recognition, filled with understanding. The jury, the onlookers, even the clinic's lawyers couldn't escape the truth she was laying bare. There was no denying it. Asha's life mattered, and the system had failed her. Outside, the protests had grown even larger, fueled by the passion of those who had heard Asha's story and felt the injustice of it in their own bones. The streets had become a sea of people, holding signs that demanded accountability, that demanded justice, that demanded change. The woman stood at the front of it all, her heart heavy, but her resolve stronger than ever. She had seen the cruelty of the system firsthand. She had watched as Asha's cries for help had gone unanswered. And now, standing in the courtroom, she would make sure that Asha's death was not in vain. She would make sure that the clinic and all the people responsible for her suffering would be held accountable. The clinic's defense team, dressed in their polished suits, tried to downplay the situation. They claimed that Asha had been difficult, that she had refused help, that there had been no wrongdoing on their part. They painted her as a woman who had caused her own demise, who had refused to cooperate, who had brought her fate upon herself. The woman's heart twisted as she listened to the lies. She knew the truth. She had seen the footage, the documents, the testimony from the medical staff who had been too scared to speak out until now. She had seen the long history of similar cases where black patients had been neglected, ignored, or dismissed simply because of their race, their class, or their circumstances. This was not just about one woman. This was about the countless others who had been treated the same way, who had been erased from the system, their lives rendered invisible. It wasn't just Asha's story. It was the story of an entire community, the story of those who had been silenced, who had been pushed to the margins, who had been told their lives didn't matter. It was the story of every person who had been turned away from healthcare, from justice, from dignity, simply because they weren't deemed worthy enough to receive it. The woman took a step forward, her gaze never leaving the judge. Her voice, now filled with a quiet, searing intensity, rang out across the courtroom. Every person deserves to be seen. Every person deserves to be heard. Every person deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of the color of their skin, their gender, or their socioeconomic status. But we live in a world where people like Asha are invisible. They are pushed aside, ignored, and treated like they don't matter. But they do. Asha mattered. She mattered. And she deserves justice. As she spoke, the faces of those in the courtroom began to shift. Some looked away. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But others, those who had long been complacent in their silence, began to listen. For the first time, they saw Asha for who she truly was. A woman, a mother, a daughter, a human being. They saw her not as a problem to be solved, but as a life that deserved respect, that deserved care. Outside, the crowds grew larger still, their chants louder, their voices stronger. They were no longer just protesting the clinic or the system. They were protesting a history of violence and neglect that had gone on for far too long. The weight of their collective grief and anger was palpable, and the woman knew in her heart that this was just the beginning. The clinic's administrators, sitting in the back of the courtroom, were growing increasingly desperate. Their faces were tight with fear, their hands clenched in frustration. They had tried to control the narrative. They had tried to erase Asha's story. But the truth was out now, and it was too late to stop it. The woman took one final look around the courtroom, her eyes locking with the jurors, with the judge. She knew this moment could change everything. It could be the moment when the system finally had to answer for its actions, when the people who had been ignored for so long finally had a chance to be seen. She knew it wouldn't be easy. She knew that this battle, this fight for justice, would take everything she had. But she was ready. She was ready to fight for Asha, for every person who had been discarded by the system, for every person who had been made to feel less than human. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity. The tension was unbearable, the weight of the decision hanging over the courtroom like a storm cloud. And when they finally returned, the woman held her breath, her heart racing. The verdict was read aloud. Guilty. The clinic was held responsible for Asha's death. The administrators, the medical staff who had failed her, the system that had allowed it all to happen, they would be held accountable for their actions. The woman's eyes filled with tears, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of triumph, of knowing that justice had been served. Justice for Asha, for her family, for the community, and for everyone who had ever been silenced by a system that had failed them. As she walked out of the courtroom, the weight of the moment settling over her, she knew that this was just one battle won in a war that was far from over. The fight for justice, for equality, for humanity, was a long and difficult one, but it was a fight worth every ounce of effort. Asha's name would be remembered. Her life would not be forgotten, and the woman, standing tall and proud, knew that she had made a difference. The reckoning had come, and it had changed everything. We would love to hear your thoughts on this story. What do you think about the events that unfolded? Have you ever experienced or witnessed racism in your life? Your stories and feedback mean a lot to us, and we value each and every one of you. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you enjoyed the story. We truly appreciate your support. Wishing you a wonderful day ahead. And please, share your thoughts with us in the comments below. To let us know you've listened all the way to the end, feel free to share a phrase that resonates with you from the story.